So there's a lot more to being a developer than just learning to code. Today we're going to be discussing software development best practices, including things like testing, TDD, CI/CD, PRs and code reviews, monitoring and observability, and documentation. But firstly, welcome back to the Junior Developer Link. We started this podcast to kind of help the next generation of junior developers, and with me today to discuss all of that, I've got Olivia. She's head of engineering over at OpenSC. Hi, Olivia. How are you?
Hi, very good. Thank you for inviting me. Really excited to be here.
Oh, good to have you on. So, Olivia, tell me a little bit about sort of like your background and how you got to where you are.
Sure. Um, yeah, I guess I took a very traditional route into software engineering. So I studied computer science at university. I graduated quite some years ago now from University of Nottingham. Um, I, it's hard to say exactly how I found myself there. I think I was good at IT at school. My dad had been a programmer and he kind of pushed me towards the programming side of things. So I think maybe if he wasn't aware of programming, I maybe wouldn't have found my way into computer science.
Was that from when you were like
Um,
very young, or was that when you were deciding what to do at like university?
yeah, this was sort of GCSE level. So, when I guess when I was sort of 14, 15, that sort of age.
I
And
was I
actually,
was picturing him kind of like getting you to program in COBOL when you were like five for a minute there.
no, I think I was always interested in computers. I was lucky enough to have sort of a family computer at home. I think I was just playing games, and I don't know if you ever remember Neopets or anything like that. Or like
No, I don't.
MySpace, there was
Yeah.
like a few websites where you could modify your profile by using a bit of HTML. So I think I kind of sort of always had a kind of interest into
Yeah,
it.
it was the custom
Found it.
backgrounds and the music and the top friends. What a calamity that was.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so I guess yeah, I always had an affinity for coding somehow. And actually, I remember when I was at college, I went to college and I studied. I chose the college I went to particularly because they had computing, not just IT. So I did computing as an A level, and I remember someone from the university, I think it was St. Mary's University, they came in and did a talk about AI. I think this was back in like 2010 or something. It was quite a long time ago. Which is interesting to think about given like all of the advancements in AI at the
Yeah.
moment. But yeah, I remember I think that was the first time because it was someone from a computer science department. I think that was the first time it clicked where I was like, oh yeah, computer science, like I could do that at university. And then yeah, it kind of just went from there. So I went and studied. Um, yeah, continued to love my craft. And then from there, I got into web development. So I did a placement year while I was at university with a startup in London, sort of e-commerce startup. Um, and yeah, just like went from there. So was doing PHP, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And then I stayed with them. After I graduated, I came back and worked with them for a few years. Then I decided I wanted to start freelancing, just to kind of broaden my technical skills, get a bit more experience across different industries. And that lasted for all of about 8 months.
Right.
And I
I
was,
I feel like
yeah,
people either like love or hate freelancing. Like the way people have
yeah,
described it to me is they're either way too busy or like not busy enough, like constantly.
yeah. I did really enjoy it, and I guess you get a lot of variety in what you're working on, and you can get really good jobs, and conversely, you can get not so good jobs. And I guess some organizations, not all organizations treat freelancers in the same way, and sometimes it's a bit more transactional, a bit more like in
Yeah.
and out. You're there to do a job. But yeah, I really enjoyed my time freelancing, but I actually stumbled upon a permanent job in Berlin. So I was looking
Oh,
for
cool.
my next thing. And I spoke to a recruiter and just came across this job in Berlin. So that was with a consultancy, but it was a consultancy focused around building new startups. So it's very sort of software development focused. And yeah, so I moved, picked up, left London, went to Berlin by myself, which was, yeah, a bit scary. I think I didn't think about it too much until I was sort of, the week before, like, oh my God, I don't speak
Yeah.
German. I'm moving to a different country all by myself, new job, new everything. But yeah, it was a fantastic experience, and yeah, one of the best things I've ever done. Um, so yeah, it was really good. I got to work across several different what we called venture builds. So basically starting new startups from scratch. So building all the technology from scratch, hiring a new team that would take over, launching it into the market. I don't know if you're familiar with Hey Car. That was my first venture
No.
that I worked on out of Berlin for Volkswagen Financial Services.
Was it all
And
mostly English speaking for when you were
yeah,
out there?
yeah.
I've heard that about the majority of German companies, right? Is English the kind of like primary language for business over there?
So I only have experience in one company really, but I think there's a lot of startups there where English is the first language that's
Yeah.
being used. Yeah, thankfully, because
Yeah.
my German is still terrible, despite efforts made to learn the language. Um, but yeah, so yeah, Hey Car recently launched in the UK. Well, I say recently, in the last couple of years. I think it's been around a while now. Time's moved quickly. So yeah, worked across a few different startups and got really good experience. And then I had the privilege of working on a couple of social impact ventures there. And with one of them, I actually stayed on, and that's where I am now. So yeah, working as the head of engineering. Yeah, we're a small startup, about 30 people. We're fully remote, so we're working with
Cool.
people across Europe and Australia. So yeah, it's very interesting. I'm used to the kind of startup environment, very ambiguous, things changing all the time, rapid pace.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I'd say I'm really a full stack developer. I've gone very broad, worked with a lot of different technologies. I like to work across the stack, like front end, back end. More recently, been doing a lot of DevOps work. And yeah, I love learning new things, trying out new technologies, that kind of thing.
Brilliant. And we'll come on to this more in a second, but I think particularly over the last few years, as a recruiter at least, it's probably similar for you when you're hiring people. People do seem to be looking more for the way that people code as opposed to the specific languages. Like you see even on job descriptions now, they're like any of these four backend languages. We use this, but like if they've used any of these four, but they have these principles and like all of this kind of stuff on top of that, then we'd be interested. It's not necessarily like PHP developer must have 5 years PHP. Like obviously there's still jobs like that out there, but it seems to be getting more generalist like software engineer, as opposed
Yeah.
to like must have X amount of years in these three things. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. That's something that I've definitely seen, and it's definitely what I've looked for in recruiting processes. I think, especially when you're looking maybe at this more the senior level, when someone has worked with multiple programming languages, they kind of understand all of the different concepts behind coding. They sort of they've built up the capability to learn things and read documentation, figure out how to learn a new thing, and I think that's the kind of thing you're looking for, someone who can learn quickly. And I think, a lot of companies will be looking more on well, not more, but like for a lot of the sort of cultural or like softer skills around like communication, how you work with the team, because those things are a bit harder to teach. Like I think a lot of actually sometimes the coding and like the technical side can be the easy thing to teach. So yeah, I think a lot of organizations will focus on training people to, learn their stack and not expecting that someone will know their entire stack and be able to jump in and code in that.
Yeah, for
And I
sure.
think as well the sorry the landscape is I've seen is changing quite a bit. I think the things like DevOps, the tooling and the 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 way that you can work with DevOps is becoming much easier over time. Like there's lots of abstractions. It's becoming easier for sort of not non super DevOps sysadmin type people to get involved and start working with that. So I think there definitely is, you know, it's less of these like defined roles. Like we're looking for front end engineer, we're looking for a back end, we're looking for a DevOps. I think there's a lot more sort of full stack opportunities and looking for more generalist people.
For sure. And you chose obviously software development best practices. Like why do you think that for particularly new and kind of junior developers, why do you think it's so important for them to get their head around these best practices?
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting to talk about. I think it's maybe something that you might not. I think I learned a little bit about it at university, but it's kind of not the focus of your initial learning process. You initially focus very much on just like coding and writing the thing. And in a lot of companies, the sort of best practices is already done for you, and it's maybe like been defined. Working in startups, I've seen the importance of defining some of these best practices from the beginning. And I think it's just, yeah, it will be for any developer that goes into an organization and starts working. It's good to be aware of like the best practices and the types of other technology you'll be interacting with, not just like the code that you're writing, but all of the things that go around it that contribute to making really good quality software that is good for the user.
Yeah, for sure. So and I think it's even more important for like I think the boot camps are quite vastly different in how people kind of come out of them. But say, for example, you come out of a boot camp, you've learned to code, but you've learned kind of like let's assume nothing from software development best practice. Like very unlikely, it would probably have to be quite a poor boot camp, right? But let's say like either it's very light or kind of nothing. First of all, we're going to go through kind of like testing and TDD. I'm not sure whether you put these in like an order of importance or whether you were just brain dumping like onto this page. But would you say that is the most important one to kind of go for first?
Yeah, I think let's start with testing. I think it's the root of a lot of the best practices. Yeah.
For sure. So like why should you test your code?
Good question. Um,
Very short question. It's not
yeah.
mine.
Um, yeah, testing is really important, I think. And I think a lot of organizations put it as like a very high priority thing during interview processes. They're looking for people who know how to test their code and who work in a sort of test driven manner. And testing enables you to make sure that the code that you've written does what you expect it to do. Often the code that we're writing can be kind of complex, and coding itself is very abstract. Like you're holding a lot of information in your brain when you're writing code, and you might be making mistakes. Like we're human, we're kind of error prone. And writing documentation allows you to automatically test that the output of your code is what you expect. And you can also, in an automated way, test all your different edge cases, like run different scenarios to make sure that the code's still working in all these different scenarios. It provides really good documentation as well. Like if you write good tests, it's a lot easier sometimes for people to come in and read those tests and understand the actual desired um, intention of that piece of code rather than just reading the code itself. Um, and I guess this kind of links on to another best practice, which is making sure that you're running those tests every time that you make changes to your code. So multiple developers working on the same bit of software, if you've got tests that run every time that you make changes, then it's very easy for other people to see if they've inadvertently broken some code somewhere, if there's suddenly a test start failing. that's a signal that something might be broken and you need to look into it. So yeah, it's I think it's one of the most important things in terms of software development best practices. It sort of make sure that you're writing very high quality code, and you're able to sort of continuously monitor that it's doing what you want it to do, and that things are not broken.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting that you said about interviews there as well, because I've seen that increasingly with obviously the dreaded technical test that the majority of companies use. But like it won't say too much about testing in the like requirements for the project. The majority that I've seen, but when like obviously as a recruiter, I can ask kind of like what are you kind of really looking for? Like it's always clean code, like clear documentation and testing. Like that seems to be always what they say. They're not really even so bothered about what it looks like and like making it pretty and like all of that kind of stuff. They want it to work as like obviously like the minimum thing and do what it's supposed to do. So and obviously see that they've read the instructions, but then they want the best practices around it. And testing seems to be in almost every single one that they're kind of looking for a minimum of like one or two, at least sort of like unit tests in there.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And hopefully, most companies would be upfront that that's something that they're looking for in their developers. I guess not all companies write tests. Like my first job, we didn't write tests. But I think nowadays, I imagine like that's what most companies are looking for. So I definitely recommend any junior developers who are looking for a job to be getting into test-driven development, reading about it, practicing it. It can feel a little bit like slow at the beginning. It feels like you're spending more time writing the tests, but once you kind of get into the flow of it, it becomes easier. And if you practice that, you'll be in a really good position. If you're doing a coding interview, definitely recommend sort of taking that approach of, write your tests, run them, um, implement the functionality, run the test again, and like, keep that sort of structure in the interview so you can talk through what you're doing and explain what you're testing. But yeah, I definitely recommend like reading and practicing test driven development prior to an interview. I think that's what a lot of companies are looking for.
For sure. What's the setup now between I guess like developers that are obviously writing their own tests and like QA functions? Because like when I first started in recruitment, probably about 10, 11 years ago now, there was literally you had your development team and you had your QA team, and the developers would develop and then it would get sent over to the QA team and then they would try and break it and then it would get sent back to the development team, and that was very much the relationship that they had. Like I even remember one client once told me that within their office, if they have ever had a disagreement between the QA team and the development team, they would wrestle, which is like I don't think that's very common these days. But like that seems to always be the way that it is. But obviously, people now want developers to be writing tests. But a lot of these organizations will still have, albeit like a smaller, but they'll still have a QA function. So how and when do the QAs get involved if you're already writing your own
Mm.
tests?
Um, yeah, I think my experience is very much on the startup side where we're working with much smaller teams. So, we don't hire people specifically for QAs. And because you're working with a smaller team with less resource, I guess we tend to put a lot more responsibility on the software developers to do that testing. So, I mean, my first job, I worked with QA testers, but that's I haven't worked with a QA person in years now.
Really? So is
So
that
I think
pretty typical
that's
within the majority of startups? There just won't be a QA. It's all on the responsibility of the developers now.
I think so. Yeah, I think when you get into bigger organizations, there's still a QA team there. But yeah, within smaller startups, it's something that you would look at doing possibly when you grow, if you ever look at doing it. But it kind of is similar with what I was mentioning about, you know, the tooling and software becoming much more advanced these days, that the lines are becoming much more blurred between these different sort of job functions. You know, you will get developers being way more involved in testing, way more involved in DevOps, and it's much less like split up responsibility. It's kind of you know, the responsibility of everyone in the team to make sure the code is high quality, it's being well tested, rather than separating those functions out. But yeah, to be honest, like I haven't worked in a big organization for some years now, so I'm not sure like if those lines are being blurred in those bigger companies as well, if that's like a trend across the industry, or if that's still very much like startup in the startup world.
For sure. I guess side point, because this is a question that I get asked quite a lot by juniors looking to enter the job market. If you had to recommend like a junior looking for a job going to either a startup or going to a larger organization, obviously you might be slightly biased, but like where do you think that there is a particular advantage to one over the other?
Um, I think it depends a bit on personality. I think generally, as a rule, you're probably you're very likely to be getting a lot more support from a bigger organization. They just have more resources, more time, more money to kind of invest in junior developers, and um, just have the support structures in place, which you often don't get at a startup. Startup depends what stage the startup's at as well. If it's like a really small startup and it's like 10 people, there's not going to be a lot of processes in place. I think a lot of startups will tend to look at hiring seniors first. Um, but you know, if it's a startup that's been going for a few years and I don't know, it's getting towards like 50 people, then and you're if you're the type of person who thrives in kind of ambiguous, changeable environments, can adapt easily, you know, you enjoy learning and sort of throwing yourself into whatever challenges come, and you sort of like that dynamic environment, then I think it could be okay. But yeah, I think generally you might not get the support. So I'm not sure I would 100% recommend it as like a first job, but I think like the answer is it completely depends on like your personality, like you know, what kind of support you're looking for,
Yeah.
where that startup is at in their startup journey.
Yeah, I think you said it's a bit of a trade-off really, isn't it, between like structure and support versus like exposure and like opportunity. Like
Yeah,
I saw someone recently that was a junior developer like 2 years ago, and they're now running a team at a startup because like they've
yeah,
just really hit the ground and like obviously given a lot of trust because of the amount of work that they've put in. Whereas at a large organization, it might be you must be a junior for a year before you're considered for the next
yeah,
step, but also you'll probably have your first 30, 60, 90 days like mapped out, be with a few other juniors, be like actual coaching and onboarding and like all that kind of stuff. Whereas some startups might just, like you said, have it might be the first junior that they've ever hired, and they might really not know the processes to kind of support them properly. So it is a trade off,
yeah,
I guess. So second
yeah.
one we'll
You're
go on to,
completely
and
right.
you touched onto it briefly before as well, more of the DevOps side of things, particularly CI/CD pipelines. So for someone that's not been, I guess, exposed to that before, like what are
Mm,
CI/CD pipelines, and why should they be
yeah,
using them?
yeah. So CI stands for continuous integration. So that's about um, continuously merging changes into into a shared repository. So you work with automated software called so you create what we call CI pipelines, and they do a series of steps and they do a series of checks, and then if those checks pass, if you get a tick, this is all good, then it will automatically, you know, merge your code into the main repository. So I think hopefully if you've been done a boot camp or been studying computer science, you'll be familiar with version control. So something like GitHub. So Git, you know, you have your repository with your code, and you can branch off it, write a new feature, and then merge that new feature into the main branch. So continuous integration is that process of sort of continuously making changes and then pushing it back into the repository. And you have these CI pipelines which kind of enable that. And the automated checks that get run, things like, if you've written automated unit tests, if you've written unit tests, they will get automatically run. If they're all passing, then you get like a check. There's also other things like linting, so sort of checking the code for sort of syntax errors, things like that. Um, Again, you get a check, and then if all of those checks pass, then it will be merged. And continuous deployment is sort of one step further, which is like if all of those checks pass, then your code will be automatically deployed to an environment. So that might be, deployed into a staging environment, maybe deployed straight into production. Um, yeah, I hope I've explained that kind of
Yeah.
semi-clearly. They're kind of abstract concepts, but it's really this like automated process of running some checks, running tests, so that you can keep merging new features on a very regular cadence into production.
And again, talking about how things were like 10, 15 years ago, like it basically means that you no longer have to take the whole thing down in order to make changes, right? It means that you can continue to make changes with things still live effectively.
Yeah, yeah, it's all like very closely linked to agile ways of working and this sort of like idea of delivering new features to the user as quickly as possible and not getting away from this, old processes which used to be like waterfall process where it's like we design the software, we spend, X months building it, and then we're going to release it to the customer. It's more like focused on continual change and getting continual new features and new tweaks into the hands of users, on a daily basis or even more frequently than that.
Sure. And I guess similar to like a QA function, it's going to depend on the size of the company, right? You might be working alongside a DevOps team or like one DevOps engineer or potentially none. Like how would if you are working, do you have a DevOps engineer at your companies that you work at?
No,
So,
I,
so you kind
I,
of again you take on that full
yeah,
responsibility as the development team as well.
yeah, myself and all of our software engineers take on that responsibility. Um, so yeah, I think if you're joining a company, um, even a small startup, it's quite possible that they'll have these processes in place. We use software called Circle CI. There's one called Travis. I think there's a bunch out there. You're going to see it if you push code to your Git repository. You'll probably see like the checks running. So you'll probably be interacting with at least the interface by Git to see if the code that you've pushed is running correctly. You're probably not likely to be, writing these pipelines in the first instance, but it's good to understand like the steps that they're going through, how to sort of look if there has been a problem, like look at the logs that have come out and figure out how to fix the issue.
Nice. And then number three, we're talking about PRs and kind of code reviews. I'd say that's going to come up in pretty much every tech company, right? So, what are those from a kind of basic point of view, and why do people need to be aware and kind of used to them?
Yeah. Yeah, this has been something I've seen in every company that I've worked in. It's more on the manual side of checking for code quality. So if CI/CD and unit tests and other types of tests is more on the automated side, code reviews and pull requests is on the sort of manual side, making sure that you've got different eyes looking at a piece of code before it gets merged and deployed to production. And I think different companies have different processes around this. Usually, I think most companies will require that you create a pull request. So when you've written your code for a new feature, you need to create what's called a pull request, which is like this is a request to merge my feature. It's ready to go. And then I think most companies will want at least one code review from another software engineer to kind of manually check through the code, see if there's any potential issues with it, and then they sort of, hit approve or write some comments of things that might need to be changed before it can be merged. So yeah, like I think yeah, different companies have different processes. I think there can be like a point of friction in teams as well. I think it's definitely a skill to learn, like reviewing someone's code. It can be very time consuming. Sometimes people can kind of get a bit offended if they've had loads and loads of comments on their code. I think it's good to be conscious of the things that you're calling out. Like I try personally not to sort of nitpick on code reviews, like all the tiny things that maybe don't necessarily matter, maybe like variable naming and things like that. And those things are often picked up by a linter these days in your sort of automated process. Um, but yeah, I think code review is really important. I think again, it kind of speaks to software development best practices. But when you're writing code, it's good to avoid creating really huge PRs because they're really time consuming. They're really difficult to review, like reading through like loads and loads of different files and different changes. And if it's necessary to have a really big PR, it's often good to do a pair code review and just walk through the code with someone, sort of explain what it's doing. But yeah, it's really like different companies have different best practices around that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think similar to testing, I think they're bringing this into a lot of interview processes that I see now as well. And like you said, almost more important for people to be able to take the critique of their own code than
Yeah.
anything else is what I see being tested quite a lot. So they'll no matter how good the code is, they'll talk to them about, oh, what could you have done it this way, or like this is what I think about it, because I think some people like could potentially get quite precious about their own code and getting that feedback, whereas it's something that you need to be able to receive as well as give to other people, right? But I'd never really thought about that going into a new company and then being asked to do like a code review of someone that's been there for a while, potentially more senior than you. Like that must be quite daunting, because if you're sat there and more junior and you're seeing things that you think are wrong with it, but it must be almost a toss up between do I not say anything or like is it my job to definitely say something? Like it must be quite an awkward thing to have to do, particularly like being new within a company.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think that speaks to being new anywhere, and especially as a junior developer, is like I guess a lot of people have a fear of asking questions, and sometimes you don't question something. You take things for granted, like you see something in the code base, it doesn't make sense, but you just assume that it should be there. But I think it's really important just to push yourself to ask those questions because it's very likely that someone else there is also thinking the same thing and maybe just hasn't doesn't is too scared to say it or feels unsure about it. And often, you know, things things are out of date. It was written by someone who maybe left, and like actually that code doesn't need to be there anymore. And or I see code still in our code base that I'm like what was I doing back then? Like that doesn't make sense anymore. So I think it's important to try and push yourself to question. And yeah, it doesn't need to be accusatory as well, right? It could be like, what does this do? I don't understand. Can you explain it to me?
Yeah.
Um, and I think people are always kind of open to discuss those things, and especially if you're new, people are usually there to help you
Yeah.
and answer your questions.
And like you said, I think the tone of it is probably quite important. So what does this do rather than this is wrong is probably quite a big one, right? But that's but
Yeah.
that's funny. Like I've heard people say that before that they've looked back at code and been like, who did this? And they're like, oh, it was me 5 years ago. Like, whoops, my bad. Oh,
Yeah. You
interesting.
can always, yeah, that's the thing with Git blame. You always know who did it. You
Yeah,
can
for
always look
sure.
up who wrote the code.
Oh, nightmare. But yeah, I guess it's good to know how to do it and the time to do it. And like you said, even if you're a junior, like just a fresh set of eyes on something that, like you said, is going to be very complex that someone's been working on for a long time, and that you're holding so much information that once you've done it, like just having a fresh set of eyes to kind of look over something like can just have like a completely different opinion, and it's not your code like either, so I guess that will give a different perspective to someone who's written it and thinks like it's
Yeah,
perfect, for someone else to come in that isn't, I don't want to say precious about it, but they're not, like, you can be quite proud, I guess, about things that you've done. To have someone come in that is not theirs, to just have a second opinion of like, oh, have you thought about this? Like, I'm not sure about this. Like, must be really useful to get just a fresh set of eyes, no matter what the level.
yeah. Yeah, and I think as well, just generally over the years, I've learned to be less attached to my code. I think working in startups and we're building a lot of things, um, things change and we're not quite sure what we need to build. We have some hypotheses that we need to test. We sometimes just build the wrong thing and just need to throw the code away. And I think like going through that process and having to throw code away that I was kind of proud of, kind of made me feel less precious or like less attached to the code. It's the organization's code at the end of the day, and we're all here to learn as well. And I think if you see it as a learning process and really try to appreciate any comments that people have about your code and just assume that people are trying to help you because they probably are. Take those things on board. You can learn and become a better coder.
For sure. And then number four, you've got monitoring and observability. So tell me a little bit about that and why that's important.
I guess often when we're writing code, we're so focused on just like building the feature, delivering it, getting it out the door, and then it's like, oh, I'm done, it's over. But the reality is it's not over at that point. Like it goes into production, people are going to use it, maybe it's going to break in the future. Like you need to be able to keep tabs on what's actually happening with your software. Um, so again, like different companies have different setups. There's lots of tooling around it. Um, we use a software called Datadog, which gives you loads of different insights into your software and how things are running. But I think a lot of, especially in startups, when you're building your features, you need to be thinking about how am I going to monitor this when it's in production. So do I need to send some extra logs or metrics somewhere to understand like how users are interacting with this or how this is functioning? Um, we set up a lot of alerts which will automatically come into our Slack, so our messaging service, so that we're aware when things go wrong or if like data stops coming in somewhere to a piece of our software. So it's important to kind of think through how you're going to how you're going to measure the success of the thing that you've built, how you're going to monitor it while it's running in production. Is there anything that I need to be alerted of, like if this goes wrong? Um, and yeah, most companies will have some software set up to support that. So ways that you can create a dashboard to see metrics about the application. Um, yeah, it's a sort of an important piece that we often don't focus on when we're thinking about building a feature. It's just like build it, release it, done. But that there's always more to it than that.
Yeah, like you said, there's the reality of like someone is actually going to use it and it might break. Rather than like that's done, next, it's kind of like I guess it is one of those things where you do need to then get feedback from people and then change things, and obviously you hope that it doesn't break, but it might break, and the reality of it. So that's obviously a really good point. And then number five, you've put, it might be a boring one, but it's important, documentation. So yeah, we obviously touched on it briefly before, but I guess, is this something that you've consistently had at all of the organisations that you've worked with? Is this pretty common practice to have documentation?
Documentation's a really hard one, and I'm not sure if I've seen it done amazingly anywhere. I think the challenge, especially when you're moving quickly and you're building lots of new stuff, like keeping documentation up to date can be quite difficult. Um, but yeah, documentation is really important. I guess I've seen the effects of things not being documented. Someone is really deep in a topic, they spend a long time on it, they build loads of software, um, they don't document it, and then they leave. And then when someone else needs to come in and pick it up, it's really hard to sort of figure out what is there, why it's there. Um, so I guess I've seen the effects of not having good documentation, and I've seen the benefits of documenting everything well as you go. And I think you have to think a bit about what it is you're documenting. I think if you're documenting code, a lot of companies use libraries where, you automatically get documentation from your automated tests. Um, if you're writing code documentation, you probably want it to be close to the code. But there's always other types of documentation about, like, I don't know, about processes that you have in your organization, about features that you've built, like things that are non-trivial. So again, like, organizations have their software that supports it, maybe like Confluence, or we're using Notion. Like, there's loads of different sort of documentation tools out there that different companies use. So you should always just follow the sort of best practices that your company's doing. Like, bigger organizations even hire people to sort of deal with the knowledge management and how that's structured. Um, I think it's good. It's always good to think about, like, if someone else was going to pick this up, like, what would they need to know? Um, but yeah, it is kind of boring, and it's kind of hard to keep things up to date. But I definitely, in a small startup, I see it as everyone's responsibility to think about documentation, keep it up to date. Even for myself, like, I will do something that is a bit challenging, upgrading a bit of our infrastructure, have to go through like quite a long process, and I always write that down and document it in our documentation space, because when I have to come back and do it 6 months time, I've got this documentation that I can refer back to of how I did it last time. And then it's also there for someone else to pick up in the future as well.
Yeah, for sure. That resonates with me quite a bit. Obviously, having kind of building a startup ourselves here, like there's always so much to do that feels more important than some of the more, as you said, more boring kind of process stuff. So, like even us updating our system and implementing like internal processes and all of that kind of stuff, it always feels like we need to find people for this client. So like that has to be a priority. Whereas like on your side, like I'm sure there's you don't get to the point where you're like, well, everything's written, like it's all done. Like we'll do some documentation tomorrow. There must always be like more to do. But like you said, like just spending that extra, whether it's a couple of hours or whatever it is, like documenting it well and taking longer over doing it right will either mean that you will be able to do it again easier the next time and actually save yourself probably more time than you would have actually spent on it this time. Or like you said, it's so important for other people to be able to look at it and see how you did it and things like that. If you are to move on or like even be away or anything like that, like people need to be able to know what's been done and kind of how it's been done.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's just as you said, if people are not around, it's good to have these things written down. So I think that there's different things you can do to make it easier. Um, you know, for for some of our meetings, we've talked about, using we record a lot of our meetings, and we turn on the transcription as well, and then summarize those notes afterwards to kind of share them and make it a bit easier. We use Loom, which is like a tool for recording like quick videos, which we found really useful in a
Yeah, we
remote
use that as
setting,
well.
to just like explain something and just like keep those together. Yeah, so I think there's different things you can do to make it like less boring or make it a bit easier. Um, but yeah, we found we needed to make sure that we're documenting things like our regular retrospectives to make sure that, we've got action points documented somewhere. They're going to be followed up. Like we've got notes. Because otherwise you get to the next retrospective and you're like, what? Like what happened last time? Like not sure. Like we kind of, there's so many things going on. You can't remember everything. You've got to get these sort of processes in place to make sure you write the
Yeah.
important stuff down.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting you say you use Loom, like we do the same as well. And it was actually last time that I was onboarding someone and teaching them all of our like internal systems and all of that kind of stuff. I was like, "Oh, if I just do this once now on Loom, then that same me can teach everyone else." So like it felt like a long afternoon doing it again for no one like at that point, but we've got them now to be able to give to
Yeah.
everyone else. So that is good. And then the last one you've said is just something else to learn about. And I've not heard of this one before. Yagni?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, so there's sort of common software engineering principles. Again, this is like maybe a bit boring, but I think there's like some very relevant software engineering principles, ones that I really resonate with. So YAGNI stands for you ain't gonna need it or you aren't gonna need it. And it's it's basically a principle that says don't don't add in a feature or a bit of software that you don't need right now. So I think there can be the temptation when you're writing some code or you're writing a feature to kind of predict what you think you might need in the future. It's like, oh, while I'm here, I'll just add in this like extra thing that's going to be helpful later. Um, and I definitely like lived this experience building startups of, you know, not having a lot of process in place, having a lot of hypotheses about what we think the user's going to want or need, and just being like, okay, well, we're probably going to need this like login screen soon. And then you build it, you spend all of this time, making it work, adds extra overhead to the original feature. And then something changes, you know, you find out, you do some user testing and you find out, that's absolutely not what the user wants, or you're working with a client and the client changes their mind, a million things can happen that mean, it was a waste of time. Um, and yeah, like if you should avoid sort of wasting that time and effort and overhead to build things and focus on building the minimum thing that's going to meet the requirements and deliver some value to the user, and work iteratively rather than sort of trying to predict and build the perfect thing, because you're always going to get it wrong. You're always going to build the wrong thing if you do it that way. So yeah, that's just something that I've seen over and over again working in startups. Really focus on building your MVP, so your minimum viable product. Um, yeah, and there's some other software engineering principles out there. Keep it simple, stupid. I think that's quite a good one. I think as software engineers, we have a tendency to want to um, make things make things really beautiful, like use all of the library functions, the sort of functionality from the programming language to write sort of very concise and what we might consider beautiful code. But sometimes when we do that, we make it more complex and actually more difficult for someone else to come in and read later on. So I think focusing on just like making your code very clear, very simple, avoid adding complexity at all costs, because as you add complexity into a code base, it just makes it more difficult for people to come in and understand, and it just slows development so much over time.
Yeah. And I think I've seen that on a few like feedbacks from sort of technical tests and stuff like that. They're just sort of like people will be like, "Oh, I spent 10 hours on it." And like the feedback's always just like, "Why?" Like, this should have taken like an hour, like have it done. But like you said, people just add more and more and more and more and more, and it doesn't necessarily make it like do what it's supposed to any better. It
Mm.
just makes it more complicated, and just kind of like unnecessary.
Yeah.
I think, like you said, the functionality of it and like the like coming back to like the processes around it and the way that it's been done is way more important than like the overall complexity of it.
Yeah. Yeah, at the end of the day, you're building something. You're building something for a purpose. You're building something for a user. It needs to be functional and useful. And yeah, we love our craft, right? We like coding. We like to learn and figure out ways to do things better. But it's important to kind of keep that in mind that you want to build quickly and get something out there for the user and the business.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for your time, Olivia. I really enjoyed chatting to you, and I think some really, really useful bits of advice in there. If anyone has any kind of like follow up questions or anything like that, like where would be the best place to kind of reach out to you? Is it LinkedIn or other social media?
Yeah, I'd say LinkedIn is a good place.
All right. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And anyone that is listening, also thank you. We're going to be doing some more episodes over the coming weeks. And any follow-up questions for myself, for Olivia, or future sort of podcast recommendations for guest speakers or topics, email podcast@thedeveloperlink.io. Thanks, Olivia.
Thanks for having me.